The sun was a molten coin sinking behind the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the dry, dusty plains. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant howl of coyotes. A reminder that the wild had its own rules, and it was far from forgiving. In the fading light, the small Apache settlement sat quietly against the backdrop of red rocks and endless sky. Smoke curled lazily from a single fire, and the soft murmur of voices carried across the camp like a whisper of old stories. She stood a little apart from the others, a young Apache girl whose eyes held the depth of desert storms and the softness of spring rain. Her hair, dark as the midnight sky, fell in waves over her shoulders, and she shifted her weight nervously, glancing at the horizon as though expecting something or someone to appear. The other girls had long since gone to fetch water or gather herbs, leaving her alone. Caught in a moment between childhood and something more complicated, something she couldn't name. "No one ever kissed me," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind. It was a confession, a small, trembling truth that had nowhere else to go. She didn't expect an answer. The words were meant for the open air, for the desert that stretched endless and silent around her. But the world has a way of listening when you least expect it. From the trail that cut through the sage, a lone figure appeared, silhouetted against the setting sun. His boots kicked up little puffs of dust, his hat tilted low over weathered eyes. He was a cowboy, a man of the land, hardened by miles of trail and sunburned days, yet carrying a gentleness in his posture that seemed almost out of place in the harsh wilderness. There was a steadiness to him, the kind that made you believe he had seen enough of life to know when someone needed more than words. He stopped a few paces away, his horse snorting and stamping the dry earth. The girl didn't move, didn't know if she should. There was a tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm, the kind that makes every heartbeat feel louder. He tipped his hat and gave her a slow, careful smile, the kind that could belong to a friend or a stranger who meant no harm. "You okay there, little one?" he asked, his voice carrying the rough edge of the trail, but softened by a tone of concern. She shook her head, uncertain if she should speak. She had been taught to be cautious around strangers, to measure the intentions behind every glance. But there was something different about him, something that made her chest tighten with curiosity and an unfamiliar longing. "I just said something," she murmured, her words tripping over themselves. She felt ridiculous admitting it, but the confession had already spilled out. She couldn't take it back. He nodded slowly, as if he understood without needing the rest of the story. "Sometimes it's the small truths that mean the most," he said. He dismounted with a quiet grace, boots crunching against the parched ground, and moved closer. The sun painted his shadow long and dark, stretching toward her, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities. The girl's gaze dropped to the dirt, afraid that if she looked up, she might see more than she could handle. But the cowboy didn't rush her. He crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to her level, not imposing, not demanding. It was the kind of gesture that spoke louder than words, a patience that seemed almost foreign in a land where survival often came before sentiment. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, softer now. The wind played with the strands of her hair, lifting them against her cheek, and she shivered, though not from cold. Her heart beat faster, and she realized with a mix of fear and excitement that this moment might change something inside her. The world around them, the fading light, the distant hills, the whispering sage seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed to a crawl, and for a heartbeat the noise of the world faded. There were no other voices, no other hands reaching out, just the two of them caught in a delicate balance between curiosity, courage, and the kind of innocence that made life worth noticing. I never knew what it was like," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The words were like fragile glass, trembling yet honest. She didn't know why she trusted him with something so personal, but the cowboy had a way of making the desert feel less lonely, of turning wide empty spaces into something almost comforting. He studied her face for a moment, reading the fear, the hope, the quiet ache for connection that no one had bothered to acknowledge before. There was no rush in his movements, no pressure, just a slow, deliberate respect that made her chest tighten. In the old ways of the plains, actions often spoke louder than speech, and he seemed to understand that better than anyone else she had met. "You know," he said after a pause, "sometimes it's the first time that matters most. The first time can change everything." His eyes softened, the shadows of the setting sun flickering across his face. He didn't need to explain more. She felt the weight of his words settle gently over her, like the first cool evening after a long, burning day. The wind picked up, rustling through the sagebrush, carrying a faint chill from the mountains beyond. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the world felt suspended. The horizon glowed orange and gold, the last rays of the sun catching in her hair, illuminating the quiet courage in her eyes. She realized that whatever happened next, it would mark the beginning of something new, something she had never dared to imagine. The cowboy leaned down a little closer, careful, deliberate, as if he were aware of the fragile line between innocence and experience, between fear and trust. The girl's breath caught in her throat. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions, the kind that have no easy answers in the wide, untamed West. She wanted to pull back, but her body didn't obey. She wanted to speak, but words failed her. In that quiet, golden moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath with them. The horses in the distance whinnied, the coyotes called, and yet everything felt far away. This was a space carved out of time, a place where the rules of the outside world didn't reach. She could feel the weight of all her unspoken desires, her small confessions, resting against the calm strength of the cowboy. And then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept across the earth, the moment hung on the edge of possibility. Neither of them moved, both waiting for something neither fully understood. The desert held its secrets close, the night promising darkness and mystery, and the girl felt her heart racing in a way she had never known. Somewhere in the distance, the first stars began to prick the sky with their silver light, and the cowboy bent down, his face near hers, and a quiet, careful smile touching his lips. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, not knowing what would come next, but knowing, deep in the core of her being, that the world had shifted. Something had begun, fragile as the desert wind, yet as enduring as the mountains themselves. The night waited. The wind waited. And the girl, standing at the threshold of fear and wonder, knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. This sets up the story's main characters. The old American West tone, tension, and emotional stakes while leaving the moment. Unresolved to build suspense for the next part, the stars stretched across the sky, pale diamonds scattered over a blanket of deep indigo. As the cowboy straightened slowly, leaving the girl's heart still racing, the wind whispered through the desert, carrying the faint aroma of sage and smoke, and the night seemed alive with hidden movement. In that quiet, the Apache girl felt the weight of the world pressing against her, not with force, but with expectation, like the desert itself was watching her every breath. She glanced at him, the cowboy whose shadow seemed to stretch longer than the light that remained. He was a stranger, yes, but there was something in his manner, the careful way he observed her, that made her feel understood. The kind of understanding that comes from a life spent reading the signs of the land and the people who travel across it. He didn't speak immediately. He just waited, letting her heartbeat settle before bridging the space that had grown between them in that single, fleeting moment. "You've been out here long?" he asked finally, his voice a low drawl, blending into the rhythm of the wind. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Her life had been bound to the village, to routines that felt like chains sometimes, yet also like the roots of a tree holding her firm, I guess. "As long as I remember," she replied, her words tentative. She watched his face, noting the way his eyes caught the starlight, the way his jaw clenched as if he had seen things he could not unsee. There was a story behind that silence, one she would not pry into yet, though curiosity tugged at her relentlessly. He nodded slowly, as if respecting the space between questions and answers. "The land teaches us more than people sometimes," he said. "You've got to read the tracks, watch the shadows, listen when the wind changes. If you don't, the desert, well, it doesn't forgive mistakes. His words were simple, but there was a weight to them, a hidden depth that made her realize he had lived through storms and silence alike. The girl shifted her weight, her mind wandering. She had grown up listening to stories of the Apache, stories of courage, loss, of the land that could cradle you or crush you without warning. She had always felt the tug of the unknown, the desire to see what lay beyond the hills that framed her home. Yet life in the village had been steady, predictable, until now. Until the moment the cowboy had appeared on the horizon, bringing with him a storm of questions she didn't know how to answer. "You came a long way alone," she said cautiously, glancing toward his horse. "Where do you come from?" He gave a half-smile, and she noticed a faint scar that ran along the edge of his cheek, pale against his sun-darkened skin. "Places," he said simply. "Some you wouldn't remember. Some you wouldn't believe. I'm just passing through. But it seems the trail led me here tonight." He paused, then added, "Maybe it was meant to." His words lingered in the air, half cryptic, half comforting. She studied him, trying to reconcile the image of the cowboy she had imagined from stories with the man standing in front of her. He was both gentle and rough, mysterious, yet oddly familiar in a way she couldn't place. The desert wind stirred the edges of her thoughts, carrying the faint echoes of old legends and whispered fears. She felt a shiver not entirely from the night chill, but from the sense that life, in this moment, was about to shift in ways she had not prepared for. The fire from the settlement flickered in the distance, tiny sparks against the dark, signaling the presence of her people, but also the barrier between their world and the vast unknown. She wanted to go back, to return to safety and familiarity, but her feet remained rooted in the dry earth. Something in her told her that this encounter, brief as it might be, was a doorway. "I shouldn't be alone out here," she admitted, almost whispering. Her voice was tinged with vulnerability, and she hated that she felt so exposed. Instead, he nodded in understanding, as if her admission mattered more than her caution. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not tonight, at least. And maybe not ever, if you let the world show you what it has to offer." There was a weight to his gaze, a quiet invitation to trust, though she didn't know how much trust she could afford to give. Life had taught her that kindness could be fleeting, and appearances often deceived. The girl's thoughts drifted to her family, to the elders who had guided her with steady hands, to the stories of Apache warriors and the harsh lessons of survival in a land that demanded respect. She wondered what they would think of her, standing here, talking to a stranger who had appeared from nowhere. Would they understand that something had shifted inside her? That the quiet longing she had carried for so long had suddenly found a presence to echo against? The cowboy reached into the saddlebag slung over his horse and pulled out a small canteen. He held it out to her with a gesture of simple courtesy. "Water," he said. "The desert takes what it gives, but it can't hide from thirst." She hesitated, but the dryness of her throat and the warmth of the evening made her accept it. The moment their fingers brushed, a spark of connection passed between them, subtle, fleeting but undeniable. "You're brave," he said as she drank. "Most wouldn't admit to a fear like that, not so openly. But you face it." Words, though casual, seemed to carry a weight she couldn't name. She felt herself shrinking a little under the scrutiny, yet also swelling with a strange pride. Perhaps bravery wasn't always about acts of heroism. Perhaps it could also be about honesty, about speaking truths that trembled on the edge of lips. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint howl of wolves or coyotes, a reminder that the world beyond the firelight was untamed. The cowboy's gaze swept the horizon, alert and watchful, and she realized that the desert was not only a backdrop but a participant in their story. Its secrets, its dangers, and its beauty wrapped around them, drawing them into a narrative older than any settlement, older than the trail they walked. "I've seen storms like that come fast," he said, nodding toward the distant hills where shadows gathered. "They'll test you, make you wonder if you're ready for what's out there. But sometimes, they're worth it. Storms have a way of showing you who you really are." His words felt like a challenge, and she sensed that he had lived through more than the tales he told, that the lines on his face and the strength in his posture had been carved by experiences. She could only imagine. The girl swallowed, feeling the weight of curiosity pressing against caution. She wanted to ask about his life, about the places he had seen, the trials he had faced. Yet there was a sense that some stories were meant to unfold in their own time, that the desert demanded patience before revealing its truths. She nodded instead, letting her silence speak for her. And he seemed to accept that night deepened around them, and the stars glittered brighter as the last traces of sunset faded into darkness. Somewhere far off, an owl called, its voice echoing across the plains. The girl shivered again, not from cold, but from the thrill of the unknown. She felt a stirring inside her, a mixture of fear and anticipation that made every breath sharper, every movement more significant. "You'll need to be careful," he said, a note of warning in his tone. "The world out here, it doesn't forgive mistakes easily. But if you watch, if you listen, it'll teach you things you'd never learn anywhere else." She nodded, absorbing the weight of his words, realizing that this encounter was more than a fleeting moment. It was a beginning, a spark in the vast darkness that hinted at adventures, challenges, and truths yet unseen. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes once more, and felt a quiet understanding pass between them. The night held them in suspense, and the desert seemed to hum with possibilities. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, what dangers or revelations awaited. But she sensed that life, in its wild and untamed way, was about to test her, and somewhere deep in the shadows, where the hills met the sky, the first stirrings of a storm moved unseen. Its presence was subtle at first, a whisper of wind, a flicker of movement, but it carried with it the promise of change. The girl felt it in her bones, a quiet tension that tugged at her heart and kept her rooted to the spot. Watching the horizon and the cowboy who had walked into her life as if from the desert itself, the night stretched endlessly, carrying the scent of sage and the hush of unknown adventures. She knew the story was far from over, that the desert had more to teach, and that the cowboy, with all his secrets and quiet strength, would be a part of the lessons yet to come. But for now, the tension held them, the mystery lingered, and the desert waited silently, as it always did, for the next step, the next choice, the next moment that could change everything. The first chill of night settled over the desert, and the girl felt it crawl up her spine like the ghost of something unseen. The stars had grown brighter, cold and distant, yet they seemed to press in on the plain, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the flicker of the campfire, shadows moved with purpose, and she knew the night was not as empty as it seemed. There was always danger here, the kind that whispered in the grass, skulked in the hills, or rode on the back of the wind. The cowboy stood a little apart, his silhouette outlined by the last embers of the fire. He seemed at ease, but the girl noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his side as if he expected trouble to arrive at any moment. She realized that in this land, even quiet moments were rarely free from conflict. There were trails to guard, people to protect, and choices to make that could mean life or death. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly, tilting his head toward the north. His voice was low, deliberate, and she felt the alertness in it, like a trained animal sensing a predator. She strained her ears but heard only the faint rustle of wind over the rocks. "There's something out there," he said, and the shadow of a frown crossed his face. The girl felt a shiver of fear, not for herself, but for the unknown. She had grown up hearing stories of raids and bandits, strangers passing through with intentions darker than the night itself. She wondered what had brought this cowboy here, to her village, to her, and whether the danger he sensed was part of the trail he walked or something closer, something tied to the land and the people who claimed it. "I've been watching," he continued, "for tracks, for movement, anything unusual. Out here, the world tells its story if you know how to read it. And right now, it's telling me something isn't right." He crouched slightly, brushing his fingers against the dirt, feeling the imprint of a hoof, a footprint. Subtle signs most people would overlook. The girl watched, fascinated, as he traced lines and shapes in the dust, his eyes sharp, every muscle tuned to awareness. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Could be nothing. Could be trouble, he said. Either way, we need to be careful. He glanced at her and she understood the warning in his eyes. Stay close, stay quiet, stay alert. The desert was beautiful, yes, but it was also merciless. As they moved toward the fire, the girl's mind wandered to her own family, to the elders and warriors who had shaped her understanding of the land. She wondered what they would say if they saw her now, talking with a stranger who seemed to know the desert better than anyone in the village. She felt the stirrings of conflict within herself, a pull between loyalty and curiosity, between the known safety of her home and the allure of the unknown. The fire crackled and hissed as they reached the settlement, throwing shadows across the earth. The other villagers were gathered in small groups, talking quietly, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. There was an undercurrent of unease in their voices, a tension that the girl hadn't noticed before. Something had shifted in the air, and it was not just the arrival of the cowboy. She caught fragments of conversation about scouts returning late, cattle missing, and rumors of strangers moving through the territory. The threads of conflict were beginning to weave themselves into the night. The cowboy spoke with the elders briefly, keeping his voice low and calm, but she noticed the weight his presence carried. They listened, nodding slowly, exchanging glances that spoke of concern. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that the land and its people were in a delicate balance, and any disruption, whether from outsiders or internal struggles, could tip the scales. She realized that she was witnessing the beginning of a larger story, one that extended far beyond the edge of her village. As the night deepened, the girl wandered to the edge of the firelight, her thoughts restless. She thought of the cowboy, of the mystery that seemed to cling to him, and of the unspoken tension between trust and danger. She wanted to ask questions, to know where he had come from and why. But the words felt small against the vastness of what she was beginning to sense. There was a world outside her familiar boundaries, a world both thrilling and threatening, and she was on the cusp of stepping into it. A sudden noise cut through the quiet, a snapping branch, sharp and deliberate. The girl froze, heart hammering. The cowboy was immediately alert, his body moving like water as he positioned himself between her and the darkness. Shadows shifted in the distance, indistinct shapes that could have been animals or people. The desert was never still, and tonight it seemed alive with unseen eyes. "They're close," he muttered, almost to himself. His hand moved toward his saddlebag, though he did not reach for a weapon. The girl could see the strategy in his stance, the experience that told him how to react before danger arrived. She felt a surge of fear mixed with admiration. He was a man who had faced storms of all kinds, storms that could be natural or human, and he was ready. The rustling grew louder, a movement that circled their position with careful intent. The girl's mind raced, trying to anticipate what might happen. She thought of the stories of raiders and bandits, of wild animals driven by hunger, and of the countless travelers who had disappeared on the plains. Every instinct told her to run, but she could not move. Her curiosity, her growing trust in the cowboy held her in place. Suddenly, the shape of a horse appeared from the shadows, a rider barely visible beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, and he stepped slightly forward, a subtle warning. The rider slowed, then stopped at the edge of the firelight, making no move to approach. The girl could feel the tension between them, a silent standoff that seemed to stretch minutes into eternity. "Who are you?" The cowboy called, his voice steady but edged with authority. The rider said nothing at first. Then, in a voice rough and cautious, just passing through, "Didn't mean no trouble." There was a hesitance in the words, a careful choice of phrases that suggested experience with confrontation. The cowboy's eyes never left the figure watching, waiting for any sign of deceit or aggression. The girl noticed the flicker of uncertainty in the rider's posture, the way his hands shifted near the saddle. She realized that this was not just a test of courage, it was a test of judgment, a delicate balance of trust and caution. The desert was a place that demanded wisdom as much as bravery, and the cowboy seemed to understand that more than anyone she had ever met. For a long moment, silence hung like a wall. The fire crackled and hissed, and somewhere far off, an owl cried. The tension was palpable, a living thing that pressed against the skin and rattled the nerves. The girl felt her pulse quicken, caught between fear, curiosity, and the thrill of watching a story unfold before her eyes. The writer finally spoke again, softer this time. "I've heard talk of trouble ahead. Bandits, maybe worse. Thought I'd warn anyone who might need it." His eyes flicked to the girl, then back to the cowboy. There was honesty there, but also a subtle challenge. A reminder that trust in these lands was earned, not given freely. The cowboy nodded slowly. "Thanks for the warning," he said. "We'll take it under advisement. But no, this anyone out here must respect the land and its people. Otherwise, they won't last long." There was no anger in his voice, only the quiet force of authority, and the writer seemed to understand. He tipped his hat and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his horse's hooves behind. The girl exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. The night had revealed a small piece of the wider conflict that lay beyond her home. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, that the world was far larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. The cowboy turned to her, his expression calm but alert, and she felt the silent reassurance of his presence. "This land," he said quietly, "it has stories in every ridge, every shadow. And tonight, we've just started to hear one." She nodded, feeling the weight of those words. There was more to come, more mysteries, more dangers, more choices that would test them both. And in that moment, she knew that nothing would be simple again. The tension of the desert, the uncertainty of travelers, the whispers of bandits and storms, they were all part of a world she was now entwined with. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the settlement. The girl glanced toward the hills, toward the dark horizon, and felt a chill of anticipation. The night was far from over, the conflicts were far from resolved, and the desert held secrets that would not reveal themselves easily. She realized that she had stepped into a story much larger than herself, a tale that would demand courage, wisdom, and perhaps a trust she had never known before. And somewhere beyond the firelight, beyond the reach of her eyes, the desert waited, patient and unforgiving, holding its secrets close until the next choice, the next movement, the next heartbeat. The wind had grown colder, cutting across the plains with a sharpness that made the girl pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire from the village flickered weakly, shadows leaping and dancing as if alive, stretching toward the hills like dark fingers. The night seemed larger now, deeper, as though it had swallowed the horizon and everything beyond it. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a coyote, the snap of a twig felt amplified, closer, more deliberate. The cowboy moved beside her, silent, his boots crunching over the dry earth, with a caution born from years on the trail. He scanned the shadows constantly, eyes narrowing against the darkness. There was no need for words. The tension was palpable, wrapping around them like the chill in the night air. The girl felt her heart thump against her ribs, a drumbeat keeping time with every fleeting shadow. "They're out there," he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was low, tense, and carried the weight of someone who had seen trouble on these plains more than once. Could be bandits, could be scouts, could be something worse. He stopped for a moment, crouching to inspect the ground. Faint hoofprints pressed into the dry dirt, leading toward the settlement, but veering slightly, as if whoever rode through had been watching. Waiting for the right moment, the girl knelt beside him, tracing the faint marks with her fingers. Her pulse raced, not just from fear, but from the realization that the night was no longer simply a backdrop. It was alive with intent. Every sound, every shadow was a clue, and the desert itself seemed to be testing them, demanding awareness, patience, and courage. "Do you think they know we're here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The cowboy's eyes didn't leave the tracks. They might not. Out here, it's never simple. The land hides as much as it reveals. He straightened, and for a moment, the tension in his shoulders eased, though only barely. "We need to be ready for anything. This place doesn't forgive mistakes." The girl's thoughts drifted to her family, to the elders who had always warned her about strangers. about the dangers that came from beyond the hills. She felt the tug of loyalty, the pull of home. But the cowboy's presence stirred a courage she hadn't known she possessed. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also intoxicating. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind call you forward. A sudden noise, sharp and deliberate, cut through the quiet of branch, snapping somewhere beyond the firelight. Both of them froze instantly. The cowboy's hand hovered near his saddlebag, ready for whatever might appear. Shadows shifted against the hills, and the girl's stomach clenched. She could sense movement just beyond the edge of her vision. Deliberate, careful, stalking, they're circling, the cowboy whispered. His voice carried the weight of certainty, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The desert seemed to close in around them, the familiar terrain transformed into a maze of shadows and possibilities. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, was magnified in her mind. A potential threat waiting to strike. The fire in the village cast long, flickering shadows that merged with the darkness beyond. The girl realized that their safety was an illusion, fragile and temporary. The threat could appear from any direction, and the balance of life and danger hung by a thread. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to flee, knowing that courage here meant standing still, observing, and trusting the man beside her. The cowboy moved closer to the edge of the firelight, crouching low. His eyes scanned the terrain, reading subtle signs, the disturbed sand, the faint outline of tracks, the way the wind had shifted the grasses. Every detail mattered, and the girl realized that this was not just about survival. It was about understanding the rhythm of danger. Predicting it before it struck, then she saw it. A shadow darker than the night, slipping between the rocks beyond the settlement. She pointed, her fingers trembling. The cowboy followed her gaze, and a faint crease appeared between his eyes. The shadow paused, then moved again, deliberate and cautious. But its intent was unmistakable. "They know we're here," he said quietly, almost a warning to herself as much as to the shadow beyond. "They're waiting, watching, testing." His hand rested on the saddlebag again, and she noticed the tension in his jaw, the sharp focus in his eyes. He was ready, yet she could see the burden of knowing that the first move could set off a chain of events neither of them might control. The girl's mind raced with possibilities. Who were they? Bandits from the trails beyond the hills? Rival tribes? Or something else entirely? Something that carried not just the threat of violence, but the uncertainty that gnawed at the edges of the mind. The desert was full of stories, but it was also full of dangers that didn't come with warning signs. Suddenly, a horse whinnied in the distance, and the sound echoed across the plains like a harbinger. The girl's chest tightened. She had never felt the night so alive, so charged with tension, so insistent in its demands. She realized that the coming hours would define more than just this night. They could shape the rest of her life. The cowboy signaled her to move closer, and she obeyed, heart hammering. They crouched low behind a boulder at the edge of the settlement, watching the shadows stretch and flicker across the dry earth. The wind carried whispers from the hills, and she felt a presence moving deliberately, calculatingly, as though the desert itself had become an accomplice to the threat. "They're skilled," he muttered, his eyes never leaving the dark shapes. "Not amateurs. They know the land. They know how to use it." His words sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and awe. She had heard of skilled riders and fighters, but to sense them like this, invisible yet present, was something entirely different. Time seemed to stretch, the desert holding its breath with them. Every sound, the rustle of grass, the snap of twigs, the low groan of distant horses, was magnified in the darkness. The girl felt herself hyper-aware, every nerve alive, every instinct honed by the presence of danger. She realized that survival here depended on more than courage. It required understanding, intuition, and a willingness to act without hesitation. Then came the first movement. Shadow darting across the clearing between the rocks and the firelight. The cowboy tensed, muscles coiled, ready for whatever came next. The girl's fingers dug into the boulder, nails pressing into stone, as adrenaline surged through her. She could see the intent in the shadow, the deliberate approach, the calculation behind every step. This was no random danger. It was precise, measured, and aimed. "They're closing in," the cowboy said, voice tight with controlled urgency. "We can't wait any longer. The moment we act will decide everything." He glanced at her, and she understood the unspoken command. Trust, follow, survive. The weight of the night pressed down, heavy with anticipation and fear. The desert around them seemed to pulse with tension. Every shadow a question, every movement a possible answer. The girl realized that the world had narrowed to this small clearing, to the firelight and the encroaching darkness, to the cowboy beside her and the unknown waiting just beyond sight. The night had become a trap and a test, crucible in which courage and fear were mixed into a single volatile substance. Then, another sound closer, this time a rustling in the rocks, deliberate and slow. She could sense the presence circling, watching for weaknesses, calculating the right moment to strike. Her pulse raced. The desert seemed to lean in, expectant, silent audience to the drama unfolding in its midst. The cowboy shifted, hand brushing the edge of the saddlebag again. He glanced at her briefly, a flash of reassurance in his eyes, and she felt the bond of trust solidify in the tension. They were not alone, yet they were alone, facing something unseen, something dangerous, something that could change everything in an instant. Every sound, every flicker of shadow, carried meaning. The girl felt the desert's breath on her neck, the weight of anticipation pressing her chest tight. She realized that this night, this moment, would be remembered not for its calm, but for the tension, the near misses. The knowledge that danger was real, present, and inevitable. The cowboy leaned closer, whispering, "Get ready. The first move will come from them, but we decide how we respond." The girl's fingers tightened around the rock, knuckles white, every sense alive. The desert seemed to wait with them, patient yet relentless. It's a landscape of beauty and peril intertwined. In that moment, the shadows moved again, faster this time. A hint of figures emerging from the darkness. The wind carried the faint smell of leather, horses, and smoke. The night seemed to tighten around them, pressing closer with each heartbeat. She could feel the suspense building, the tension of unseen forces drawing near, the climax of the story inching ever closer. The cowboy's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching, and she knew there was no turning back. The desert had claimed their attention, the shadows had demanded their caution, and the night had made it clear that the choice of survival, courage, and action rested entirely with them, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. The first real confrontation was about to begin. The first streak of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert in soft oranges and golds that softened the harsh shadows of the night before. The wind had calmed, and the air carried a new kind of stillness, one that felt like a quiet sigh after hours of tension. The girl stood near the edge of the settlement, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, and breathed deeply. Every muscle ached. Every nerve was still humming from the night's suspense, but there was relief in the simplicity of light. The cowboy was nearby, his horse tethered to a post, watching the horizon with the same careful attention he had maintained throughout the long hours of darkness. Yet now his stance was more relaxed, the tension in his shoulders eased, and there was a quiet satisfaction in the way he regarded the girl. They had survived the night, faced dangers that had seemed imminent and unpredictable, and yet they were still standing, still breathing. Still alive, the girl thought back to the shadows, the rustling movements, the unknown presence circling the settlement. The adrenaline had been constant, the fear sharp. But the cowboy's calm had anchored her, taught her to watch, to think, and to trust not only him, but also herself. She realized that survival in the desert was as much about courage and intuition as it was about strength, and she felt a new respect for the lessons she had learned in a single night. The villagers emerged from their shelters, blinking against the morning light, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and cautious relief. They moved quietly, tending to the horses, gathering scattered tools, and speaking softly about what had transpired. Wordless glances passed between them and the cowboy, a mutual recognition of his help, his skill, and the quiet protection he had offered during the tense hours. The girl felt proud, not for any action she had taken alone, but for her presence, her courage, and her willingness to face the unknown with someone she trusted. The fire from the night before had burned low, reduced to ashes and embers, yet it seemed symbolic, a marker of the intensity that had passed. She walked closer to the ashes, letting the warmth of the rising sun touch her face. In that light, everything seemed clearer. The desert, so vast and unyielding, was also beautiful and forgiving. The night had revealed its dangers, but daylight offered a chance to understand. To move forward with knowledge and awareness, the cowboy approached, his expression thoughtful but softened by the morning calm. He knelt briefly to check on the horse, brushing away a few clumps of dust, then straightened and looked at her. "You handled yourself well," he said, voice steady and sincere. "Most would have panicked, but you stayed alert. You learned fast, and you trusted when it mattered." Act. The girl felt a warmth in her chest, a mix of pride and gratitude. She had learned that courage could take many forms, sometimes quiet and patient, sometimes decisive and sharp. She smiled, a small, tentative expression that reflected both relief and understanding. "I was scared," she admitted honestly, "but I think I understand more now. About the land, about danger, about myself." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The night had been a trial, a lesson, and now it had become a memory, one that would stay with her long after the desert returned to its quiet state. The cowboy nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon again, taking in the soft outlines of distant hills and the faint shimmer of morning heat on the plains. "The desert teaches," he said quietly. "It gives and it takes. You've seen both sides tonight, and if you carry that knowledge, it'll serve you well." There was a quiet wisdom in his tone, a recognition that life in these lands demanded more than skill with a horse or a weapon. It required patience, perception, and respect. The girl glanced toward her village, toward the small huts and families beginning to stir. She felt a renewed connection to her people, a sense of responsibility and a new confidence in her own abilities. The night's danger had revealed vulnerabilities, yes, but it had also illuminated strengths she hadn't fully recognized in herself. She felt a shift, subtle yet profound, in the way she viewed the world and her place in it. As they walked slowly toward the settlement, the cowboy spoke again, a quiet commentary that seemed meant as much for reflection as for instruction. "Not every threat is visible, not every danger announces itself, but courage, trust, and understanding, those are things you can carry wherever you go." She nodded, listening carefully. Each word seemed to stitch together the lessons of the night, turning fear into knowledge, uncertainty into readiness. The villagers gathered around the edges of the fire, curious but cautious. The elders spoke quietly among themselves, glancing at the cowboy with respect, then looking toward the girl with a mixture of pride and recognition. They had seen her grow up in this land, learning the rhythms and secrets of the desert. But now she had faced something larger, more immediate, and she had come through it stronger. One of the elders stepped forward, a tall figure with weathered features and sharp eyes, and nodded toward the cowboy. "You brought courage to our village," he said, "and for that, we are grateful. But you also showed her something important. Sometimes guidance comes from strangers, and sometimes strength comes from facing what you fear most." The girl felt a warm glow in her chest at those words, a quiet validation of everything she had endured and learned. The cowboy tipped his hat in acknowledgement, a humble gesture, then looked at her once more. "You'll carry this night with you," he said. "The desert doesn't forget, and neither will you. But it also teaches that life moves forward, and there's always more to learn." The girl met his gaze and nodded, understanding the depth behind the simplicity of his words. This was not just about surviving one night, it was about understanding the world, understanding people, and understanding herself. The wind shifted again, warmer now, carrying the scent of the plains of sage, and distant flowers beginning to bloom in hidden patches. The sun climbed higher, and the light illuminated the village, the settlement, and the expanse beyond. For a moment, everything felt still, almost sacred. As though the desert itself paused to acknowledge the trials and victories of the night, the girl and the cowboy moved toward the village together, steps in quiet rhythm. She realized how much she had learned, not just about danger, but about trust, about bravery, and about the delicate balance between caution and curiosity. The night had tested them, had pushed them to the edge of fear. And yet it had also revealed the resilience and strength that lay quietly within her by the time they reached the center of the settlement. The villagers had begun their daily routines, tending to animals, repairing tools, and preparing for the tasks of the day. The air was filled with quiet activity, a comforting rhythm that contrasted with the tension of the night. She felt herself relax slightly, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a profound sense of understanding and connection. The cowboy paused at the edge of the village, looking back at her with a small, knowing smile. "You're ready," he said. "Ready for whatever comes next. Ready to face the world as it is and to learn from it. That's the most important thing." She met his gaze, feeling the weight of experience, trust, and courage that his words carried. For the first time, the girl felt the fullness of the desert around her, not as a threat, but as a teacher, a companion, and a witness to the growth she had achieved. She understood now that life in these lands was both fragile and enduring, dangerous yet beautiful, and that the choices she made, the courage she displayed, and the trust she offered would shape not just her future, but the stories yet to be told in this vast wilderness. As the sun rose fully, casting golden light across the plains and the hills, the girl turned to the cowboy one last time before he prepared to ride out. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying both gratitude and newfound confidence. "For staying, for helping, for showing me." She trailed off, unable to find words that captured the depth of her experience. He nodded, tipping his hat again, a simple gesture that seemed to carry all the understanding, patience, and guidance he had offered. "Keep your eyes open," he said, "and your heart steady. The desert will teach you many more lessons, but you'll carry the courage from tonight wherever you go." With that, he mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the horizon, blending with the light and shadows of the morning, leaving behind both a trail and a lesson. The girl watched him go, the wind brushing her hair, the sun warming her face. She felt the weight of the night lift, replaced by quiet confidence and reflection. The desert was still vast, still wild, but she had learned how to face it, how to navigate its dangers, and how to trust herself in ways she had never imagined. She understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, and that trust and connection were as vital as skill or strength as the settlement settled into the rhythm of a new day. The girl walked back toward her home, her steps sure and deliberate. The night's tension had passed, but its lessons lingered, like a hidden map etched into her mind. She felt stronger, wiser, and more alive, ready to face whatever came next, and ready to carry the stories of the desert forward with her. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the promise of new journeys, new lessons, and new stories yet to unfold. And as she looked back at the horizon, she knew that life, like the desert, was vast, unpredictable, and full of both challenge and wonder. The night had ended, but its memory would remain, a testament to courage, trust, and the quiet strength of a girl who had faced the unknown and discovered herself.